Imagine that you're about to be assigned to a semester-long group project, and a classmate says, "You'll be working with Jordan. She's intelligent, industrious, and stubborn." Before you've even met Jordan, you've probably started forming an impression of what she might be like. Now imagine hearing something slightly different. "You'll be working with Jordan. She's stubborn, industrious, and intelligent." Notice that the descriptions contain the same traits, yet many people would come away with very different impressions of the same person depending on which of the two orders they were given these traits in. Let's try another example. Suppose you're shopping for a new sofa, and you see an advertisement, list price $2,400, sales price $1,599. A few minutes later, you find a different sofa that simply says, price $1,599. Even though the prices of the two sofas are identical, the first sofa often feels like a better deal because the original list price creates a higher reference point. Or let's do something different. Imagine that you're house hunting. A home is listed for $500,000. You know that asking prices can be inflated, and you intend to make your own independent assessment of the home's value. But research suggests that your estimate will often remain influenced by that initial asking price. At first glance, these three situations may seem completely unrelated. One involves impressions of people, another involves shopping for sofas, and the third one involves real estate. But they all point toward the same psychological question. Why do our judgments stay so close to where they begin? Much of the time, we make judgments under conditions of uncertainty. We don't have complete information. We don't have unlimited time. And we certainly don't have the ability to carefully analyze every piece of evidence that comes our way. Instead, we often begin forming impressions and making estimates almost immediately as soon as we receive the first piece of information. The surprising part is that these early impressions and initial values seem to exert a lasting influence on later judgments. Psychologists have been interested in this question for a long time, particularly within the field of social psychology, which examines how we think about, influence, and relate to other people. One topic that's received considerable attention is impression formation, the process of developing an overall evaluation of another person based on the information available to us. When we meet someone new, we rarely have complete information about them. We don't get a dossier on this person like we're in the CIA or something. Instead, we begin with a few observations, a brief interaction, or even a second-hand description from someone else. The question that interested social psychologist Solomon Asch was deceptively simple. How do people combine these individual pieces of information into a coherent impression of another person? In a series of classic studies conducted in the 1940s, Asch presented participants with lists of personality traits describing an unfamiliar individual. The lists contained many of the same characteristics, but the order in which those characteristics appeared was changed. Remarkably, this simple change altered people's impressions. Early information seemed to shape how later information was interpreted. Rather than treating each new piece of information independently, people appeared to form an initial impression and then interpret subsequent information through that emerging lens. This tendency is known as the primacy effect. The tendency for information encountered early to exert a disproportionate influence on our judgments and impressions. A remarkably similar phenomena occurs when we make numerical estimates. Suppose I asked you, is the population of Iceland greater or less than 50 million people? And then I asked you to estimate the actual population. Now imagine I asked a different question. Is the population of Iceland greater or less than 1 million people? And again, asked you to estimate the actual population. Even though both numbers are far from the correct answer, which I'll let you Google, people often produce different estimates depending on which number they encounter first. The initial number becomes a kind of starting point for a later judgment. Psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman called this phenomena anchoring and adjustment. According to their account, when people are asked to make a judgment or estimate under uncertainty, they often begin with an initial value or a reference point, an anchor, and then adjust from that starting point to arrive at a final answer. The anchor may come from the environment, such as a listing price, a first offer in a negotiation, or even a completely arbitrary number. In other cases, people may generate their own starting point based on prior knowledge or experience. The critical insight is that our final judgments tend to remain too close to the initial anchor. We do adjust our estimates, but that adjustment is often insufficient. As a result, the starting point continues to influence our judgments, even when we know that the initial value is arbitrary or partially relevant, only partially relevant to the decision itself. What's striking is that these effects appear in many different situations. They influence our impressions of people. They influence how much we're willing to pay. They influence negotiations. They influence legal decisions. They even influence experts who know perfectly well that they should ignore irrelevant information. The remarkable breadth of these findings suggests that our minds almost never approach a judgment from scratch. Instead, we begin somewhere with an anchor, an early impression, an initial interpretation, or the first number we encounter often becomes that anchor. As new information arrives, we do adjust our judgments, but usually not by abandoning our original starting point and beginning again. Instead, our judgments tend to remain tethered to where they began. At first, this might seem like a flaw in human thinking, and that's one way that this has been approached by Tversky and Kahneman. If our judgments can be influenced by first impressions and arbitrary numbers, why would our minds work this way? From this dual process perspective, anchoring and adjustment may reflect the normal interaction between these two systems. System 1 provides a starting point, and System 2 modifies that starting point in light of additional information. Importantly, however, psychologists who study judgment and decision-making increasingly argue that this process should not be viewed only as a source of error. The fast-and-frugal approach to heuristics emphasizes that people often must make judgments with incomplete information, limited time, and finite cognitive resources. In these situations, beginning with an initial impression or reference point and then adjusting from it may be an efficient and adaptive strategy. Imagine if every new piece of information forced us to completely reconstruct our impressions of other people, or recalculate every estimate from scratch. Everyday judgments would become slow and mentally exhausting. Starting somewhere gives us a workable foundation for making sense of uncertainty and updating our judgments as new information arrives. The challenge, of course, is that our adjustments are not always sufficient. Sometimes the starting point remains more influential than it should, causing our judgments to stay too close to where they began. So perhaps the most interesting question is not whether anchors influence our judgments. They clearly do. The more interesting question is this: when does relying on an initial starting point help us make efficient judgments? And when does it lead us astray? Understanding that tension between efficiency and error is one of the central goals of research in judgment and decision making. Psychologists have spent decades investigating that question, and the answers turn out to be more complicated and more surprising than you might expect.